So, the cameras are rolling, the seats are packed. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Roll for Initiative, a 50-year history of Dungeons & Dragons here at MAGFest 2024. Woo. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday evening with me. My name is Sean C.W. Korsgaard. I am a U.S. Army veteran. I have worked for Bain Books, Writers of the Future, and Analog Science Fiction Fact. And, as of 8 months ago, the proud papa to a new baby boy. And I have been playing Dungeons & Dragons since 2006. But I am taking on a rather intriguing and nigh impossible task, summarizing 50 years of tabletop RPGs in an hour. I can't do it. So, I'm going to do what every good host should do at the beginning. Give all of you some homework. Because if you would like to know more, these are the places I've pulled from. There is a fascinating history of this wonderful hobby that is almost as intriguing as any campaign you could want to play. Some of the world's greatest fantasy, as we will get into. And some tales of backstabbing, wheeling and dealing, and saviors and villains who have improved, harmed, and brought this hobby into what it is today. But where did the game begin? Way before we got to a Wisconsin basement where Gary Gygax spawned this game. Well before we had the wargaming hobby that helped give it the foundation it needed. I take you all to where you'd naturally think a game of elves and dwarves would begin. 18th century Prussia. The very first, what we recognize as a tabletop game, is called Kriegspiel. It literally war game in German, which was invented by the Prussian military as a way to teach their officers a way of strategy. And, as anyone who's played D&D will recognize, this is where a lot of our familiar elements come from. Each game was supervised by an umpire. We call them dungeon masters now, who would throw out different battle conditions, objectives, things you were meant to achieve. You had terrain, fog of war, and objectives you were meant to achieve for each team. And there are still versions played even unto this day. There are several active circles here in Northern Virginia, including a particularly active one in that 5-sided office building across the Potomac. Although I hear the invites for that one are pretty restrictive. But we fast forward to just after the aftermath of World War II. This is when a lot of people were starting to look into hobbies, and we get the beginnings of modern wargaming. They range from mail correspondence games, like Battleship, which was actually played pen and paper before we had the board game. Board games like Risk and Diplomacy. Diplomacy is especially of note because that is where we get a lot of our role play that early D&D pulled from, and if you want to play it, they have a copy in the room next door. And a full range of tabletop war and strategy games like Gettysburg, Tactics. This is where Avalon Hill got its start. A lot of these companies are still involved making these games to this day, and they actually are required at Gen Con to have a small section dedicated to them because this is where our whole hobby began. They created the market and tools necessary for something like Dungeons & Dragons to be created, because without this, there were no miniatures, maps, correspondence, sales. The D20, for example, got its start from mail catalog. The miniatures market began here. For all of our folks who love painting their elves and rangers, it began with people wanting to paint Union and Confederate troops or various World War II tanks. And this is also where fanzines and Gen Con got its start. So this is where our humble hobby really starts to take its early shape. You also have Appendix N. Who here has heard of it before now? Okay, so for the rest of you, I am sorry, this is going to be a tangent. For much of the 20th century, the fantasy genre's dominant subgenre in America was sword and sorcery, very different from the epic fantasy that dominates the genre today. For creator Gary Gygax, these were the works that he considered so critical to understanding the game of Dungeons & Dragons, he included a reading list in the back of every single player's and DM's guide. And it's easy to see when you see just how much of the hobby traces its roots to these works. It spans 28 authors and 43 works specifically, including Conan by Robert E. Howard. I swear, Frank Frazetta has sold more books than most authors. This is where we get barbarians, rogues, the wild lands facing off against civilization, and If you want a sample of what's in store for this, I recommend reading The Tower of the Elephant, which, for anyone whose first impression of Conan is the admittedly wonderful Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, this gives a very different impression of both Conan and how one might approach a barbarian. By the end of the story, you have a lithe teenage Conan who has not only failed to come away with any treasure, but has encountered a space alien, a wizard, and come away poorer than he started. And it's one of the greatest fantasy stories ever told. Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock, from which we actually get the alignment system. Order and chaos play a very big role within the series, and it's from where we get lawful versus chaos in terms of alignment. It's also where a lot of the influence of stuff like the Dark Elves come from. The Dying Earth series of Jack Vance plays a very heavy role because this is where the entire magic system is pulled from. This is why spells are limited. This is why spells are named. This is why you can only cast a certain amount of spells in a day. Just for a show of hands, who here has ever read a short story called Leanne the Wayfarer? Okay, so for the rest of you, look that up right now. It is a 3,000-word short story. You'll never look at rogues in the same way again, and you will encounter what was one of the very early bosses of Dungeons & Dragons. Word of advice, if you encounter a boss named Shun the Unavoidable, run. Do not just run. Trip over your nearest companion and leave them to die, and run. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, from which we get our halflings. They're totally not hobbits. I promise they're not hobbits. Please don't sue us, J.R.R. Tolkien's estate.
Is this any good?
Okay, I actually need to see this. Show of hands, who here has never read a book by Tolkien? Okay, I'm out.
How many people have finished the Silmarillion?
Okay, now we're going into crunchy territory.
I've tried 4 or 5 times, I just can't.
Thothard and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber. This is where we get our thieves, our guilds, the ideas of urban campaigns. Why Appendix N matters today. Beyond the fact that Dungeons & Dragons as we know it today would not exist without these. Again, this is where we get our classes, our characters. Many of the early campaigns were literal adaptations set in Lankmar, the Dying Earth. This is, part of the reason it was considered required reading is because by reading these texts, you gain a better understanding, not just for the material, but for how you can approach it from a role-playing perspective. Barbarians are not just thugs who get to hit really hard and get an extra die. You get an idea for why a character should be lawful or chaotic. You get better grips on the mechanics, the motivations, and I think part of the reason a lot of modern D&D campaigns strain these days is they've sort of outgrown sword and sorcery roots. This is a game that is very well designed if you, say, want to be a group of thieves that break into a sorcerer's tower to steal his jewel. It is not very well designed for a campaign to save the world, where in 6 months you and all your friends have jobs and can't dedicate another Saturday afternoon to it. I equate Appendix N as the engine to a car for Dungeons & Dragons. It's possible to ignore as a passenger, impossible to ignore as a mechanic or DM, and you remove it at your peril. But we go back to the age of wargaming and enter one Gary Gygax. Before he created Dungeons & Dragons, he was the founder, one of the founders, of the International Federation of Wargaming and the Castle and Crusade Society, one of a lot of these wargaming and historical gaming societies. And he launched a little convention up in Wisconsin at the time called Gen Con, named for his town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. This was before it moved to Indianapolis. He gained some notoriety for a game called Chainmail, which introduced a number of innovations to the hobby. Man versus man combat, and notably, it included a 14-page fantasy supplement, one of the very first of its kind, and it earned a very interested fan who had some ideas for it. Enter Dave Arneson from Minnesota. He used Chainmail to run set games in a fantasy kingdom he created called Blackmore, which would go on to be one of the first settings within Dungeons & Dragons. He had individual characters exploring a monster and trap-filled dungeon he created. Players did not get new characters at the beginning of each session. This is where you could carry characters into each session starting to come into play. He actually made a point of approaching Gygax about perhaps threading the two systems, because Dungeons & Dragons could not have existed without the level of detail that Gygax brought to it, or the character focus that Arneson did. And together, we got TSR. This idea for Dungeons & Dragons was not able to find a publisher, so they had to create one. Alas, Tactical Studios rules still needed some startup capital, so they took out a life insurance policy from one of their employees and funded their very first game, called Cavaliers and Roundheads. Show of hands from our audience, who here wants to roleplay in the English Civil War? Yeah, Gygax didn't think of that, so they lost nearly everything on this game and had to start from scratch. So Dungeons & Dragons got its role in the post-Cavaliers and Roundheads crashing and burning era. They needed a new source of funds. And so they approached a man named Brian Bloom, a die maker. He was a gamer who could see the potential in this, and so he bought shares into the company. It was now a three-way partnership, and the first 1,000 copies of Dungeons & Dragons were produced in 1974. This is where it all began, the White Box. The set includes a 36-page Volume 1, Men in Magic, the 40-page Monsters and Treasure, and the 36-page Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, as well as 6 reference sheets and tables and charts which were meant to be photocopied or copied by hand. To this day, every single game of D&D is built around these same mechanics. Rulebooks, monster manuals, player's guides, and adventures. From here, the game was split in two as sales took off. They saw exponential growth those first few years. They actually couldn't produce them fast enough. And of course, even as they did produce it, they got requests for a crunchier system, a more difficult system, a more advanced system. So naturally, what do they call this new system but Advanced D&D? The basic was a smash hit. It was selling 4,000 copies a month by 1978, and 100,000 copies the following year alone. And the advanced system is where they got to start branching into some really interesting stuff. This is where Dragonlance was introduced. Oriental Adventures was practically a new setting in and of itself. TSR and D&D continued to grow on their own, and TSR actually began to experiment with other RPG systems. The first non-Dungeons & Dragons system released by TSR was actually a Western called Boot Hill. And another one was called Empire of the Petal Throne, which was a fantasy based in Mesoamerica. There were some setbacks during this era as well. This is when Dave Arneson began a decades-long acrimonious feud, depending on which one you ask. Either he or Gygax started. But it ended with a notable deal signed with Random House to distribute D&D material nationwide. And so, the tabletop RPG era begins. It was still a very young industry at this time, though, however. Most of the competition at this time was not so much competition, so much as very, very thinly veiled copies of Dungeons & Dragons. Such as Tunnels and Trolls, which was the second fantasy RPG. One of the more unique ones was based on Watership Down, called Bunnies and Burrows. For when you want to traumatize your children the second time from Watership Down. And to my mind, I think the most unique was the first science fiction RPG, known as Traveler, which to this date I think has one of the coolest box arts in all of tabletop. It was known for that iconic black box with the cry for Mayday from the space-free trading ship Beowulf, and for a crunchy level of difficulty where you could literally die creating your character. This was actually a signature thing of this era, is that a lot of these games were bone-crushingly difficult. You were not meant to have your same character for years and years at a time yet. So a lot of these campaigns would throw your characters into the mulcher and you took it with a smile. Of course, one thing they didn't quite take with a smile, Satan. This is where the Satanic Panic comes into play. Although it predates Dungeons & Dragons for a number of years, TSR and D&D found themselves in the thick of it following the disappearance of a 16-year-old college student named James Dallas Egbert III. Now, he was a Dungeons and Dragons player, but it didn't really reach attention until the private investigator hired to find Egbert, a Texan private investigator slash con artist. We can say this because the man has since involved himself in everything from alien abductions to the O.J. Simpson trial, blamed it on Dungeons and Dragons, and claimed he got lost during a live-action campaign in the tunnels beneath his university. A media circus began, headlines nationwide. Dragon cult may lead to missing boy. Game cultist still missing. And of course started an outcry from concerned teachers, students, and parents. The truth is actually far more depressing. Egbert had had a mental breakdown, attempted suicide, fled the state, attempted suicide again, and once he saw the case making national headlines, the detective, who was nowhere near to finding him than the other end of his own bottom, he called him, approached him, and returned to his family. Deere got a book deal out of it. A movie was made starring Tom Hanks. This is actually what started Tom Hanks' film career, which is the only good thing we can say about mazes and monsters. And Egbert would get to see neither of them, because he committed suicide after a successful third attempt. D&D would remain a fixture of hysterics, claiming the books screamed when burned, and even earned a dedicated lobbying group, and an infamous chick tract, which is free to read online for any of you who guys want a few yucks later.
Don't do it.
Ironically, it also earned a lot of attention from church and synagogue groups who thought it was a wonderful game to introduce to kids. During my research, I actually found a wonderful quote from a youth minister who told the Southern Baptist Convention that they should give TSR an award for doing more to keep teens sober and sexless. Enough Mormons actually adopted the game during family game night. It's one of the credited reasons for the rise of the Salt Lake City fantasy scene, including a little independent struggling author by the name of Brandon Sanderson. The panic and one of the smart things done by TSR was they were happy to play both sides to increase publicity and sales. TSR's sales grew so much between '79 that they had $2.3 million in sales that year, and by '83, when the Satanic Panic had turned its attention to other concerns, like I assume, I don't know, puppies or something, they were making $27 million a year.
Is that in back then money or back then? Back then money.
In back then money. Today, that buys you what, a sandwich and a tank of gas? I haven't. Now, one of the things I have to highlight for this era is that that first edition of Dungeons and Dragons spent a grand total of $100 on black and white hand-drawn artwork. The later editions, however, would be one of the definitive looks of fantasy in the 80s and moving forward. Every single edition of Dungeons and Dragons has made artwork a focus for a reason. Artwork sells a fantasy novel, unless you're one of those modern publishers that like sticking just words on it now, and it sells a game. And Dungeons and Dragons discovered some of the greatest fantasy artists of its time, starting in the 1980s. It struck gold twice with the first two in-house artists for the company, Jeff Easley and Larry Elmore. Along the likes of Clyde Caldwell, Keith Parkinson, and a lot more, they defined the look, feel, and atmosphere of Dungeons and Dragons for generations. Now just, with this lovely screen projector, take that in. And if you think that's nice, Larry Elmore. There were some early stumbles, unfortunately, and growing pains. One of the things that was, TSR was a company founded by nerds for nerds. A lot of them were high school dropouts, actually. Gygax was an insurance salesman before he jumped into this business. So a lot of these folks had never had access to a large amount of money before, and brothers and sisters didn't show. The Bloom brothers, who had come to claim a larger and larger stake in the company and running things day to day, were infamous for embezzling money towards a number of strange investments, most of it by their relatives. They dumped large sum of money into a knitting business called Greenfield Needlewoman that it turns out was owned by one of their cousins. Sales bottomed out around the middle of the 80s, and so did money. Gygax, for his efforts, had bought a mansion in Hollywood that used to be owned by King Vidor, successfully got a Saturday morning cartoon made, and in between large bouts of cocaine parties, unsuccessfully tried to get a movie made. We have some scripts from the time that circulated, mostly with notes that say, needs more spanking. And one of the reasons for those declining sales was they weren't just competing against bunnies and burros at this point. We had the first golden age of the tabletop RPG. Some of these actually got their start because of, well, TSR making bad deals. One company in England, for example, was the sole distributor of TSR's merchandise over there. That deal came to an end in the early 80s, so they began creating their own games. This company is called Games Workshop. Others, such as Chaosium, explored genres that TSR hadn't had to yet, with Call of Cthulhu. VASA had Battletech. And I just want to highlight some of the heavy hitters of the era, as well as some of the more obscure ones at the bottom here. GURPS, for when Dungeons & Dragons isn't crunchy enough and you have a free week. From Steve Jackson Games. TSR and D&D may have created this industry, but never again would they dominate it the way they have. Warhammer. Warhammer 40K. The Call of Cthulhu. Woo! Battletech. And Cyberpunk. Now, with the slumping sales and the feud between Gygax and the Bloom brothers reaching a fever pitch, things finally came to a head in 1985. Gygax, rather cleverly, enacted an option to buy 700 shares of TSR stock, which, along with his son's shares, gave him a mere 51% stake in the company. The Blooms were removed after a board meeting, and Gygax was, for the first time, in sole control of TSR. This would last 6 months. The company, still in debt and facing layoffs, Gygax reached out to his Hollywood contacts and sought outside investment and maybe someone with a bit more financial sense to help run the company. One of those contacts gave him one name, Lorraine Williams. Less than 6 months after being brought on board, she purchased a majority of shares, and the first thing she did was remove Gygax from the company he founded. And the second thing was sue him from trying to start his second company. Don't worry, you'll find a whole lot of reasons to hate Williams by the end of this.
Capitalism ruins everything.
Williams remains a controversial figure in Dungeons & Dragons history. I've seen her nicknamed the Kathleen Kennedy of her time, both unreasonably and reasonably so. She kicked out the creator in a hostile takeover. She saved TSR from bankruptcy in 1985. She had doomed it to bankruptcy by 1997. She was the first person to figure out how to financially run the company successfully, get people paid on time, bring freelancers on staff. She was excellent with staffing. She had a terrible eye for business, on the other hand, because several of the moves she pushed would cost the company millions. She has gone on record exactly once since leaving the company for the book Up, Dice, and Men. This is the reason I told you, you're going to have some homework. And I try to be a little more fair because, again, all the sources, except because she's never gone on record, are very anti-Lorraine Williams. A couple other events aside, mostly involving the Buck Rogers estate, which her family owned. Don't worry, that's going to be important moving on. One thing she did, though, was greenlight Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. With a small team of designers led by David Zeb Cook, they created the first real overhaul of the rule set and game since its launch. It was known for introducing a lot of elements, streamlining the rules, and these beautiful box sets that had full-color maps, posters, player's guides, dice, miniatures, even video cassettes and CDs in some boxes. To this day, there are still players that maintain that 2nd edition had the highest level of quality control for the franchise. And part of that was the campaign setting was, to this day, never equaled by Dungeons & Dragons, although there's a reason for that, which we'll get to. The hallmark of 2nd edition was that they created multiple settings that not only had rulebooks, they had box sets, map, tie-in novels, toys, artwork, merchandise. And they took players to worlds never imagined, not just in tabletop, but in all of fantasy. And these range from the strange and surreal, horror, science fiction, fantasy, post-apocalyptic. And some highlights include Ravenloft, which was a gothic horror campaign that pulled from everything from Dracula to Frankenstein and had what many consider the most tightly bound and enclosed adventure introduced in the game at that point. To this day, it is still a terrific tabletop supplement. Dark Sun, a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting known for its breathtaking artwork, bone-crushing difficulty, and wild twists to what were by then cliches of the fantasy genre. For example, those cute, cuddly halflings that live in holes, they're cannibals now. The elves are all nomads and thieves. Slavery is common, and in fact, your first campaign and setting involves freeing yourself from the gladiatorial pits. Death is so common, you start on level 3, and it might not help you. Planescape, which was where we get planar travel and some of the most striking, strange adventures ever introduced into the franchise. Spelljammer, which, in addition to some beautiful Venetian-styled artwork, introduced what every fantasy setting needs: space travel. Al-Qadim, an Arabian Nights-style fantasy setting, which introduced djinn, new magic, new classes, and perhaps most notably, the Forgotten Realms. And that, remember when I mentioned tie-in novels, though? This was something that they started in the 80s with the first set in the Dragonlance setting by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. The first New York Times bestsellers put out by TSR. But they soared to new heights by the 1990s and these campaign settings they created. There was a time that TSR was the second largest publisher of fantasy in the United States. That they were making more money on Dungeons & Dragons books than they were on Dungeons & Dragons games. They actually briefly considered spinning off the publishing division into its own company. A lot of this success was because they struck gold with one author in particular, R.A. Salvatore, whose novels in the Forgotten Realms setting introduced what might become the most iconic character in all of Dungeons & Dragons, Driss Do Erden. Now, the funny thing is, Driss began his career as a sidekick to a barbarian character named Wolfgar, quite literally pitched to TSR over a phone call. He ended it by selling 35 million books. He has survived. Salvatore and the Driss series have survived 3 different ownership changes for Dungeons & Dragons, 4 different publishers, and the series itself is often listed among the greatest fantasy series ever published, including NPR's 100 Greatest Works of Fantasy and Science Fiction. For a franchise that has created literally millions of heroes, this dual-wielding drow elf might well be the one that stands above them all. Now, we had those beautiful settings, the second largest fantasy publisher in the business. Where do things start to go wrong with TSR in this era? They had some notable non-Dungeons & Dragons successes. They actually had a Hunt for Red October tabletop game that was the most successful war game of all time at that point. They also, unfortunately, put out multiple Buck Rogers tabletop games, RPGs, and board games, whose sales numbers I will politely describe as cataclysmic. Show of hands, who here has ever read a Buck Rogers comic book, tie-in novel? Where were you in the 90s then? One of the weirdest things is that a lot of the issues in this era will continue to tie back to Williams and Buck Rogers. For example, comic books. TSR actually enjoyed for most of the 80s a very profitable partnership with DC Comics. which put out 2 comics based on Dungeons and Dragons and Forgotten Realms, respectively. And these were among DC's best-selling titles of the era. They actually sold better than Wonder Woman. And they were very happy to continue this deal, until during a business call, Lorraine Williams asked them to also publish a Buck Rogers comic book. And they politely laughed in her face. So she decided TSR would invest millions into starting a rival publishing company. And DC responded by canceling both Dungeons and Dragons comics while retaining the rights to publish them, and saying if they publish anything called a comic book, they'll send the lawyers. So they published comic modules. And how many of you know what the comic book industry was like in the 1990s? Let me give you a hint. This was the decade that bankrupted Marvel Comics. This was not when you wanted to launch a comic book publisher, as TSR would learn to its great misfortune. By the mid-90s, TSR West, as the comic publisher was called, would be shut down ignobiously. The holy grail for TSR for this era, at least to upper management, was to create what they... we're not there yet. But another infamous business deal, though, was they came within a hair's breadth of producing a Lord of the Rings tie-in for Dungeons and Dragons. They actually successfully negotiated with Christopher Tolkien, who had just, along with Saul Zanet's estate, signed off on some movies by some Kiwi named Peter Jackson. They'll probably never go anywhere. But part of the agreement was, with Christopher Tolkien, that TSR would get the rights to do a tabletop RPG. Toys, action figures, merchandise, calendars, artwork. They would get everything except one thing, which Christopher Tolkien remained steadfast on. No new original stories. I mean, can you imagine if somebody bought the rights to Lord of the Rings and created original stories? That would be disastrous. Now, most of the company was thrilled with the idea, except Lorraine Williams, who, when told that they would not get to publish new Middle-earth fiction, said it wasn't worth their while, and thus TSR walked away. There would be no Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons crossover. And this probably cost TSR tens of millions of dollars. What also cost them a lot of money was the holy grail of the company at the time, creating a version of D&D they could sell to 8-year-olds. They introduced a box of Monopoly during a production meeting and said they wanted that with Dungeons and Dragons. Every year between 1991 to 1995, they would produce at least one introductory box set for Dungeons and Dragons. Many of them were very expensive. One, called Dragon Strike, had a full Hollywood-produced videotape, which was supposed to teach 8-year-olds and younger kids how to play the game. You can actually find the full video on YouTube. I encourage you to watch it for 2 reasons. 1, there's no way an 8-year-old would ever sit through this. And 2, it is... The polite thing to say is it looks like a bad episode of Power Rangers. The impolite thing to say is it looks like a bad episode of tattooed teenage alien ninjas from Beverly Hills. And they dumped millions on this videotape alone. And this box set had over 150,000 units that did not sell. 150,000 units sitting on shelves, sitting in warehouses, occupying space that otherwise might have gone to products that did sell. And of course, once again, the competition began to heat up. For most of the early 90s, the main rival for TSR and Dungeons and Dragons was White Wolf, with their Vampire the Masquerade, the punk grunge artist to D&D's aging hair metal band. They both were blindsided by this newcomer out of Washington State, which took the entire industry by storm with what would become the most profitable tabletop game in the history of the industry. That new company was called Wizards of the Coast, whose trio of Peter Atkinson, Lisa Stevens, who also worked on Vampire the Masquerade, and whose name will come up again later, and Richard Garfield had just released Magic the Gathering, the first trading card game. They introduced it at Gen Con 1993, with printing 2.5 million cards. Gen Con, as now, was a 4-day convention, and they had sold every single card by the end of it. By October 1993, they'd they'd sold the entire first print run of 10 million cards. By the end of the following year, they'd sold 1 billion more. Wizards of the Coast was not profitable by tabletop industry standards. They were profitable by small movie studio standards. And part of this was trading card games were revolutionary in the tabletop market. They offered one thing that most tabletop role-playing games had been chasing for 30 years: repeat business. This is one of the reasons why game stores and bookstores favored Magic the Gathering. Even the best D&D setting, you might sell a book once or twice. Unless somebody spills soda on it, that book will last them the rest of their lives, which is one of the reasons why you have all these additional material. Magic the Gathering, meanwhile, they'll be back for PAX as soon as they get their next paycheck. You get that repeat business again and again and again. So slowly but surely, Magic began to take shelf space that once would have belonged to Dungeons and Dragons. And here's the thing, TSR actually had a competing product, the second trading card game on the market, called Spellfire. And it sold very well for its first run. The issue was, it needed support from higher up in the company. And Lorraine Williams hated Wizards of the Coast, hated Magic the Gathering, and did not want TSR producing something like Magic the Gathering. So Spellfire floundered while Magic the Gathering literally made itself a mint and entrenched itself as the dominant trading card game of the 90s. TSR and Dungeons and Dragons with it by this era was large, bloated, and as would soon be discovered, bankrupt. Those 14 campaign settings, which I'd mentioned earlier, as it turns out, were cannibalizing each other. Rather than each introducing new players to the business, their business strategy called it the bait strategy. You'd use a different bait to catch a marlin than you would a salmon. Instead, you'd have 20,000 people buy a Dark Sun set. You'd have 15,000 buy a Spelljammer set. And each would take away sales from the core Dungeons and Dragons sets. Sales were falling off a cliff, and the worst was still to come. Because that increased competition and some bad business decisions, remember when I said there were 150,000 unsold beginner's box sets? What, as it turns out, Lorraine Williams had been doing with TSR is a process known as factoring. Basically, mortgaging pre-orders and future sales to get loans to produce the next set. Which is fine when things are selling and you're doing very well, but theoretically, if you just produced a multi-million-dollar CD and you signed an exclusive distribution with a computer chain called Babbage's to be the one to sell it, and then Babbage's goes bankrupt, so all those CDs are now on wholesale, and you make pennies on the dollar for what they were produced, now you're in trouble. TSR made $40 million in sales in 1995. It began 1997, $30 million in debt, falling around of Christmas layoffs that cut staff to the bone. Why do Christmas layoffs sound familiar? I'm sure it's nothing. Dungeons and Dragons was quite literally to the point they could not print new books. TSR sold its factories. In fact, their landlord was their former printer, and they were, by some estimates, weeks away from shutting down entirely. This well could have been the death of the hobby, and instead, an unlikely savior arrives in the form of Wizards of the Coast. They made an offer to buy TSR, because it turns out the people running Wizards of the Coast loved Dungeons and Dragons. Lorraine Williams refused. Again, she did not like Wizards of the Coast. So in comes a company called Five Rings Publishing, this new startup at the time that had a good game, didn't quite have the money to produce to their numbers, so they wanted a company to buy them. And during a lunch with the folks over at Wizards of the Coast, TSR came up, and they come up with an idea, an ingenious, wonderful idea. Five Rings Publishing would make an offer to purchase TSR, and then, once the initial deal had been signed, Wizards would buy Five Rings Publishing. And after hitting a few more snags, the last time Buck Rogers comes up in this slideshow, I promise, is that Lorraine Williams refused to sell if the Buck Rogers rights were included. And to give you an idea of how very different the business practices were at Wizards of the Coast, Peter Atkinson, pretended to care and be upset, and asked that that's fine, but we're knocking $1 million off the purchase price, to which Williams agreed. Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR and Five Rings Publishing for $25 million on April 10, 1997. The collapse of TSR remains the largest, most high-profile failure in the history of the gaming industry, and the closest Dungeons & Dragons has ever come to extinction. This period remains the low point in its pop cultural relevance, and until 3rd edition, it still looked like the game couldn't be saved. At best, maybe Wizards would pump out one last edition to make a few bucks, and that would be the end of it. To give you an idea of just how irrelevant Dungeons & Dragons was to its core audience at the time, I was a kid at the time, and I'd read a ton of the Drizzt novels. The Magic the Gathering cards, aka Crack on a Pack, was selling faster on playgrounds than I assume Crack did on certain other playgrounds. Wizards of the Coast also had this other game called the Pokemon Trading Card Game that was my drug of choice at the time. I was a nerd. My friends were nerds, and none of us had heard of Dungeons & Dragons until Gary Gygax showed up on Futurama. That is how far the hobby had fallen. So, it is something of a miracle that with all of that money from Dungeons & Dragons and Pokemon cards, that Wizards of the Coast actually took the time to digest and integrate TSR. They brought back a lot of the staff that had been alienated or lost, and they did an autopsy on everything that had gone wrong to figure out the best way to bring Dungeons & Dragons back. This is where Lisa Stevens comes in. She did a full audit of the company, and this is where we found out that those box sets were a disaster. Despite those beautiful box sets and artwork and settings, turns out you want to keep them within the Dungeons & Dragons sandbox. So, a team of designers, led by Monty Cook, Jonathan Tweet, and Skip Williams, began work on a modernized version of Dungeons & Dragons, which would kick off the new millennium with a bang. And so begins 3rd edition, which, along with a shortly introduced 3.5 that ironed out some balance issues, would become the most dominant form of the game played for probably close to another decade. This is where the iconic D20 system was introduced. Gone were the vast box sets, in favor of largely books that were sent to bookstores. Players could go as deep as they wanted with the material, or stick to the shallow end of the pool. And this is going to be important later. They also placed the entire D20 system and some of the other mechanics in what was known as the open game license, allowing other companies to not just make material for Dungeons & Dragons, but to make games that use those same mechanics. I'm sure that won't backfire in any way. And here's where our second villain of the story comes in, Hasbro. Yes, boo Hasbro, boo them. Hasbro purchased Wizards of the Coast in 1998 because they wanted that Magic the Gathering and Pokemon money. Dungeons & Dragons wasn't even on their radar. It was a dead brand at this point, which, as it turns out, was to Dungeons & Dragons' advantage. That's probably why Hasbro didn't mess around with 3rd edition. Fast forward a few years as Hasbro takes the formerly independent Wizards of the Coast and begins integrating the company into their game division. One of those things is they botched the deal with Nintendo that would have renewed the Pokemon trading card game. That is why Wizards lost the license. And then they take a look at what else Wizards has to offer, including that 3rd edition that's starting to fly off the shelves. Another thing they did in this time was spin off the periodicals department to a new company founded by Lisa Stevens called Paizo. I'm sure that name won't come up again later. But the second part of that plan was they noticed that video games were really eating into what they felt like was Dungeons & Dragons' market. Look at that WoW game that's selling tens of millions of copies. How do we make a Dungeons & Dragons that will appeal to the World of Warcraft crowd? You don't. Can I just, show of hands, does anybody in this room like 4th edition? My apologies to the 3 of you. I'm going to whip out my shotgun and shoot some goddamn fish in a barrel.
But how many people have used the term bloodied in 5th edition?
Fair enough.
Warlocks are way cooler in 4th edition than 5th.
This is perhaps the most controversial version of D&D yet produced. On the surface, I get why they wanted a game that would appeal to the gamer demographic, but the problem is they alienated everyone who liked Dungeons & Dragons in the process. It almost entirely removed the role-playing from the aspect. Role-playing in a role-playing game? What's this madness? It made combat much more focused, yet also less fun, and it made miniatures a requirement to play for the first time since the 70s. It also broke up the player's handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual into yearly supplements. Now, the other problem was they did this at the same time that 3rd edition wasn't even a decade old. 2nd edition happened more than a decade and a half after 1st edition and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Likewise, 3rd edition, a decade after 2nd. 3.5 was 5 years old when we got 4th edition. There was no appetite for a new edition of the game yet. And worse, it was also not public. It was published under a more restrictive license. So all those third-party vendors that were making money selling stuff for Dungeons & Dragons could not. And it left players scrambling for 3rd edition material everywhere they could find it, and searching for alternatives. And brothers and sisters, did they find one? Pathfinder. Now, remember Paizo, that little startup Hasbro signed off all the D&D magazines to? That contract ended in 2007, and like Games Workshop before it, they began looking for their own game to produce. They looked at what was coming with Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition and decided they would not run into that buzzsaw. Informally nicknamed Dungeons & Dragons version 3.75, Pathfinder instead offered people who liked 3rd edition a further refinement of it. It also introduced elements like the Pathfinder Society, a social mechanic that encouraged organized play that didn't exist until the time. And by 2011, Pathfinder had achieved what had never been done in the history of tabletop games at this point. Even in the near bankruptcy and cultural irrelevance of the late 90s, Dungeons & Dragons was still the most popular tabletop game in the country. Pathfinder took the throne for the first time in the history of tabletop. And that sent a shockwave through the halls of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. As it turns out, the literal year after they lose the throne, they decide to go back to the basics. 4th edition ain't gonna cut it. They were gonna have a new edition of the game that returns to the basics, while also threads the needle and lets new players access the game much easier. And they would have it out by the 40th anniversary. This is where we get 5th edition. Dropped in 2014. Raise your hands if you played 5th edition.
Yeah.
A lot more than 3 people, isn't it? Hailed as a return to form by fans and for newbies, this was where the ingenious idea was they had starter sets, for example, so you can just grab a box and play if you're new to the game. This is also where they start reintroducing books and settings, but never to the extent they did under 2nd edition. Those mistakes will not be repeated. It sold better than every edition of the game prior. In fact, for much of the late 2010s, sales for Dungeons & Dragons doubled every single year. But those sales and the returned goodwill and fan base didn't come from nowhere. It would take a lot to rebuild that goodwill after 4th edition. They'd need a lot of help. They got a lot of help. Insert Stranger Things theme here. Kicking off in 2016, this Netflix original show became a pop culture sensation, and it did rekindle a love for a lot of 80s properties, including Dungeons & Dragons. It is not controversial to say that Stranger Things did for Dungeons & Dragons what E.T. did for Reese's Pieces. It's arguably the most successful show in the history of the streamer, and Dungeons & Dragons could not have asked for a better commercial. The game is a literal central point of the entire series, and it's the reason why your parents know what a Demogorgon or Mind Flayer is. Of course, then you had Critical Role and the other streamers. Critical Role, started by Matt Mercer and some of his voice acting buddies, struck gold when they found out a lot of people will watch on Twitch if your favorite voice actors will play act a campaign together. Millions of views and hundreds of imitators later, Critical Role has, spin-offs, books, actual D&D campaigns, 2 licensed cartoons, an Amazon spin-off, and we'll get to their own games in a minute, but it created a level of attention and streaming that there was no market for before, and probably never will since. But you also have the second tabletop golden age, thanks to Kickstarter. If corporations would not be the ones to dump a lot of money into tabletop RPGs, well, we'll just have to do it ourselves. This really took off in the 2010s. You had mind-blowing crowdfunding success, like Gloomhaven, adapted from IP, like the Avatar RPG, and scores of small indies, like Goodman Games' Dungeon Crawl Classics, creating a system that appeals to the people who complain that kids these days don't like first and second edition. You even saw the return of many of the long-dormant properties of that first golden age come back, including Cyberpunk, Shadowrun, Battletech, make triumphant returns to form. And of course, there was the video game market, which the DNA within Western RPGs and video games is threaded so thick with Dungeons and Dragons and TSR employees, they might as well be kissing cousins. And I say this because some of the game designers behind everything from Torment, Tides of Numenera to Skyrim are former TSR employees. The Western RPG as a video game would not exist without Dungeons and Dragons. That doesn't change the fact that going back to the Intellivision, success had escaped Dungeons and Dragons in video games. They had a few cult classics here and there, like Eye of the Beholder, and of course, Neverwinter Nights, and a lot of stinkers. Looking at you, Dark Alliance. That's $60 I'll never get back.
That was $60.
Meanwhile, here's $70 I paid gladly. Raise your hands if you played Baldur's Gate 3. And of course, we've seen the scores of cosplayers walking around the convention, cosplaying everything from Carlia to Shadowheart. So obviously, this went places no Dungeons & Dragons video game has ever gone before. To the tune of 27 million sold copies, never gone before. It integrated 5th edition near seamlessly. It showcased the beloved Forgotten Realms setting to audiences that have never seen it, and in ways that people who've been there since the beginning saw all they loved, created in love and detail. It had wonderful characters, full voice acting, dizzying amounts of control. I don't think it's controversial to say there's never been a video game where you can screw up as magnificently as you can playing the tabletop game, as easily as you can in Baldur's Gate 3. And of course, near universal acclaim, Game of the Year awards, and hopefully lots of success to come, because we're not going to see that from the tabletop game for a while. Here's where Hasbro burns it all down. See, at the end of 2022, Dungeons & Dragons was in the middle of a golden age. So naturally, the first thing Hasbro is going to do is stuff its hand up the golden goose and kill it. Hasbro has been losing money for a while now. They have been trying to pivot to being an entertainment and video game company rather unsuccessfully. They've lost money on some toy lines. They are the first company in history to lose money making Star Wars toys for a number of reasons.
What? Yeah.
Yes, they've actually lost money producing Star Wars action figures. But as a result, Hasbro underwent a massive company-wide restructure in 2011 after they fought off a hostile takeover. Part of this was Wizards of the Coast mostly ceased to be as an independent brand and is now one of 3 divisions within Hasbro. They have consumer products, entertainment, and Wizards and digital. And as company losses continued to grow, Hasbro's grasp of Wizards grew tighter and tighter, usually to disastrous results. One example was, remember those very, very profitable tie-in novels I mentioned? The ones that have sold millions of copies, and by 2016, numbered 623 novels strong? They ended them. And with the exception of R.A. Salvatore's Driss books, which not even Hasbro is stupid enough to kill, they sold off the rights to those to HarperCollins. And it only gets worse from here. This should be a year that Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast should have been spiking the football all year long. And instead it ended in mass layoffs, sales in the toilet, reputations in shambles, and a question of just what awaits the company and the game in the future. Let's take a look at some of the greatest hits from the past year, shall we? One D&D and the OGL. In January of last year, there was a leaked draft from Wizards of the Coast where they planned to tighten control over the open game license that had been in place in the 2000s. Now, that tabletop golden age I mentioned that largely happened because anybody could use the D20 system without controversy, that would be gone. Wizards would have the ability to make money off of those products without paying the people who made them. And if they make over a certain amount of money, oh Hasbro, 25% cut. All hell broke loose when that news broke. A boycott was actually launched. Several game companies immediately announced they would be leaving the D20 system. And the firestorm was so furious that in less than 30 days, Wizards backed down. But the damage was done. There would be no going back, and in fact, it's only going to get worse. Remember when I said Hasbro wants to be a movie studio more than a toy company? Now, raise your hand if you've seen Honor Among Thieves. Now, lower your hands if you didn't see it in theaters. See, nobody paid for a ticket to see this movie almost.
Well, yeah.
But, okay, not everybody bought 3 tickets for it, but I salute you. The movie lost $100 million at the box office, and the Transformers movie from last year lost about the same. Hasbro, rather than pivoting to being a movie studio, sold off their film division last year for $500 million. Mind you, they purchased their movie studio for $4 billion a couple years prior, so they sicked the literal Pinkertons on a streamer. Now, there's a lot of blood in the water. And what happens when blood's in the water? The sharks come to play. The competition could not have reacted better to the way Hasbro and Wizards reacted worse. Paizo sold 8 months of Pathfinder inventory by the end of January, while also announcing that they would have a new streamlined, friendly to newcomers edition by this year. Chaosium saw similar record sales for Call of Cthulhu, as did Games Workshop's Warhammer. Catalyst Game Labs had a record-breaking Kickstarter for their new Battletech set. And to kick things off, Paizo, Chaosium, and 1,500 other game publishers worked together to create an OGL alternative, the Open RPG Creative License, or ORC. And, to go a step further, they put it in common, there is no copyright on it. There will be no backtracking on this. There will be no repeat of the mistake with OGL with this. So credit to Paizo and all those companies for playing fair with consumers and each other. Now remember when I said Critical Role played a critical role in helping 5th edition really take off? Well, the 1-2 punch of the OGL controversy, which also would have impacted streamers, and sending the Pinkertons after one of their own, bore some very bitter fruit. And a lot of D&D streamers began playing different games and launching their own, including Critical Role. They are launching 2 new tabletop RPGs, Daggerheart and Illuminated Worlds. And it's worth noting, the plans for Critical Role was originally they were to play Pathfinder. So that showcase of 5th edition almost didn't happen the first time. And it won't happen for the next one. Now Hasbro has kept the sales numbers of D&D over the past year very close to chest. You don't exactly want to tell your shareholders that you have stomped the life out of your golden goose, after all. However, we can tell from the amount of Dungeons and Dragons merchandise that have been sent to discount retailers for pennies on the dollar, where they take their rents alongside those He-Man action figures no one wanted and the Rey Skywalker action figures that haven't sold since 2017. You don't have a $100 Dungeons & Dragons box set selling for $5 unless something is very, very wrong. And in another blow at the end of 2023, the distributor of Dungeons & Dragons materials to bookstores, Penguin Random House, ceased distribution of those books. Now D&D Wizards still distributes through things like Diamond and stuff to game stores, but bookstores operate by different rules and lower losses. So they've lost a safer income stream than they had before. Which might be why they ended the year with the Christmas gift from hell, laying off 20% of the company, including a large chunk of the Wizards staff responsible for much of that golden age of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. They laid off 1,100 employees right before Christmas. Among Wizards employees, this included the designer of 5th edition, Mike Merles, Amy Dolan, the D&D Beyond host and producer, Liz Shue, the head of licensing for D&D, and the art director. Remember when I said art is critical? The person who chooses the box art got laid off, which might be why we've caught them using AI art since then. These cuts were made in spite of the fact that Wizards is perhaps the one thing keeping Hasbro afloat. That D&D was flying off the shelves right up until it ran into a buzzsaw. And these won't be the last layoffs for Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast, which means, for a golden anniversary for the hobby, looking at 50, D&D is showing every single one of its years. Even if Hasbro can right the ship, or Wizards and D&D can find new owners for the second time, that, again, that lucky break where Wizards buys Dungeons & Dragons and acts as a careful caretaker, that almost never happens. More often than not, the new owners carve out the heart and soul, wear it like a skin suit, and then throw it aside when they're done. Who's to say that even if they find a new owner, they'll be good stewards of it? Even if Hasbro rights the ship, even if Wizards and D&D can produce a 6th edition, the brand is likely in decline. The circumstances that made 5th edition the smashing, world-spanning success can't be repeated, won't be repeated. So unless 6th edition is something truly revolutionary, we're going to see a step back for Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, watch me say that in a year from now. It turns out 6th edition will do your taxes, walk your dog, and be better than your wife, girlfriend, or husband. So, who knows? That said, who gives a shit what Hasbro does? Because the heart of D&D isn't Hasbro, it isn't Wizards, it's not the books and the dice. It's the fact that we have a room filled with close to 200 people here on a Saturday night willing to look at this hobby they love, play this hobby they love, and share it with others. That this community has been created. And so long as there are people willing to get together with their friends, throw a few dice, and imagine another world, the world Dungeons & Dragons created, that began in Gary Gygax's basement 50 years ago, will never die. Now this is where I get to plug myself. I have 2 books available everywhere fine books are sold, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble, World's Long Lost, and They're Here. You can find me on social media at those tags, and if you love this panel, please let the wonderful folks at MAGFest know. And in the meantime, you will not be attacked by goblins as you leave the room tonight.